From the Radio Cafe and the Kivira Coalition, this is Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. As everyone, especially listeners to this show, have probably figured out, the COVID-19 crisis has really brought to our attention the deep problems with our food system, and there has been a surge of interest in regenerative agriculture as a path away from extraction and depletion toward thriving abundance. One thing that you can do to keep this momentum of interest in regenerative ag going is to give this show a quick review on Apple Podcasts so that other people can more easily find us and get acquainted with the many amazing, brilliant people in regenerative ag whom we've had on this program. It'll take you less than 5 minutes, and it makes a big difference. Here's what you do. You go to Apple Podcasts, you find Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast, and then scroll down to the bottom of our profile and tap Write a Review. And that's it. Give us a nice review if you like the show. It makes a big difference, and thank you. Now for our program. I'd like now to welcome Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson. He is a traditional Hopi farmer. He's a research associate with the Native American Agriculture Fund. He has a doctorate in natural resources management, and we're here to talk about traditional Hopi agriculture and regenerative agriculture. Welcome, Michael.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mary Charlotte.
So tell us, first of all, how you learned traditional Hopi farming.
When I was a young boy, my grandfather asked my father, who lived in Winslow at the time with my mom, if I could come out here and spend the summer times with him. And so I did that. And my dad would drop me off out here just about every summer. And I learned how to farm with my grandfather. He showed me how to plant and showed me how to take care of the crops when I was a real young boy.
At that time, were you using like tractors and farm machinery and things like that, or was it really more traditional than that?
It was more traditional. My grandfather didn't have a tractor, and so our field was about 1 or 2 acres, about 2 acres. And so a bunch of us as kids, when we were there, he would gather us all up together, and he would give us all a planting stick, and then we'd go out there and plant that field. And that was a long process. It usually took about an hour, 2 hours and stuff after that. And then after we got done with that, we'd have a foot race across the field because that was our tradition on how to make the corn come up and grow faster.
A foot race across the field, like across the seeds you just planted?
Yeah, we just run across the field. As soon as we plant, we just run across the field and back and, kind of race. And that was one of our traditional ways that we would allow our corn to grow and come up faster. It was just something that my grandfather loved to do, and we do that every time after we plant it.
So this is a show about regenerative agriculture, as you know, and we talk about what regenerative agriculture is in a lot of different ways. And I was wondering, how do you think about regenerative agriculture and Hopi practices? Are they the same or similar, or how do you think about that?
Well, regenerative agriculture always has to do with, restoring the soil, making sure the soil's adequate. Our way of restoring the soil is just done by natural. We plant on things what they call alluvial floodplains, and that washes in new soil every event. And so we don't have to use supplements or anything like that they're still using in regenerative agriculture, and we don't have to have cover crops because our fields are relatively small. We also plant in a direction that's conducive to not having the soil blow away, and a lot of soils that we do plant on have a pretty heavy mix of clay and sand, and so they're not susceptible to erosion. And so we use various techniques like that. Also, the water cycle, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, they're real big on the water cycle, and we conserve every single bit or drop of water that's in the ground. In fact, all of our techniques that we use are designed to conserve soil moisture. That would include our spacing, which is about 6 feet apart, with about 6 feet rows and clumps. We have more than just 1 or 2. We just don't put one seed in the ground. We put 10 to 20, and there's really reasons for that. And so everything that regenerative agriculture is teaching you today, we've done before. Somebody said one time that, that's not regenerative agriculture because your ground looks barren. But that's not so, because that ground and that soil is packed with residual matter from leftover corn stalks and everything else that we do when we leave everything on the field, and we just harvest the beans and we just harvest the corn cob itself. And so in my mind, we're doing regenerative practices is that somebody once again put fancy terminology on something that we've been doing for 2,000 years.
I saw a slideshow that you did at the Regenerate conference last year, and it was so interesting because you had side by side Hopi practices and then newfangled, whatever, regenerative practices, and they were the same thing. For example, one of the things you just mentioned is leaving the plant matter on the ground after you harvest. And there's so many reasons for that. And one of them that was so interesting to me is like that catches snow and therefore infiltrates water.
Yeah, I mean that's one of our practices too, because we do plant in clumps, and what we do is once we harvest the corn, we leave everything intact, and so like you mentioned, when the snow comes across, it also drifts across the field, and those things act like snow catchers, and so the moisture is just soaks into the soil over time. The other thing those things do also is like in the springtime when our seedlings are just now coming up, they act as like little wind breaks, and so they slow the wind down from coming across the field. One of the other things we do is we plant in what they call the horizontal position, which would allow the new water that's coming in to be blocked in certain sections and slow it down, so we don't have like soil loss and soil erosion that comes from wind and also water. And so we've been doing these things for a long time. It's just that, we're just now giving credit. What they would call that right now would be contour farming, is where you use when you plant in a perpendicular motion to what the wind pattern or the water pattern then allows that to slow things down. And so we're able to do things like that.
So Hopi farmers have been growing under, pretty arid conditions. I mean, you're in northern Arizona for 2,000 years. How has that agricultural knowledge been passed down over the centuries? I mean, do you have a sense of any kinds of like records of how your ancestors from long ago were doing things, and what's changed, what hasn't, and so on?
Well, that's just passed down from generation to generation. As a young man, you learn those things. In fact, agriculture is one of the reasons that we're still surviving today. In fact, during our creation story, we were told that we can live in this area, but we need to have faith behind everything, and so that includes our crops. And so there's really no separation between spirituality and our ceremonial system and our agricultural system, because they need each other. We need those things that we produce for our ceremonies, and also we just seem to have some sort of a benefit from what we're doing. And so that's a tradition. It's a tradition since the get-go, and so that's why we continue to practice today through, for 2 millennia at least. And so if you look at some of our conditions out here, where we only have 6 to 10 annual precipitation, in a semi-arid desert, you would be startled by that. At Cornell University, when I was an undergrad there, they told me that the crop scientists told me that I needed at least 33 inches of annual rainfall a year, and I kind of smiled and looked at them and said, I don't think your corn is that strong. And so, I have all these different things, these little stories that I like to tell about, my experience with conventional agriculture and what I saw some of the bad things about conventional agriculture. Because our agriculture is not based upon economics, it's based upon faith and who we are as a people. And so there's a big difference there. One of my favorite things is, it says, Hopi farmers, as well as most indigenous tribes, we look at conservation from the point of view of caring for a relative, and not from a scientific point of view of conserving a natural resource. And those things are totally, totally contrasting. One of the other things I like to tell people too is that, Hopi is one of the few places I know where corn is raised to fit the environment, and the environment not manipulated to fit the corn. Unfortunately, a lot of people are still doing that, and unfortunately, we're still getting a lot of cross-contamination and everything else downstream from where those people are planting, using all those pesticides and herbicides.
I mean, that's something that really struck me, because I've heard you talk about that. Land management is not so much conserving a resource, but rather caring for a relative. And that points to a really kind of different way of thinking than the scientific and Western ways of thinking. It's like a cultural perspective. And I don't know, I just wondered if you could talk about that more with respect to agriculture. In other words, that sense of life, as opposed to, we're the life and the plants are kind of more like the object.
Well, everything, like I said, everything we do is faith-based. We consider the corn ourselves as our mother. She's the one who was given to us, and she takes care of us. And it's just that type of thing. For example, like when we go out and gather sand for some of our ceremonies, for a certain ceremony that we have out here, we always leave something behind, and we've been doing that forever. So we just don't take things, and just leave everything blank. It's this whole concept of stewardship. When I was a young boy, me and my grandfather went out looking for a certain plant, for example, and we did not find that plant right away. After about an hour, then all of a sudden we stumbled upon the plants that we were looking for. And then my grandfather said, hey, we should just leave that one and we'll start go a little bit further and we'll find another one. And so we did, and we leave that. And I said, why do we do that? We've been looking for all this time. And he says, that's so we can have something for the next generation. It's always thinking about the next generation, not just one, but maybe 7 generations down the line. And so if you have that type of mentality and that type of things that growing up as a child, and you get to look at those type of things, that you get to respect and appreciate those type of situations. And so that's kind of how we look at things, as not as just being objects, or a commodity when it comes to agriculture, but actually looking at life. What is that thing going to give us? How has that thing sustained us for 2,000 years on this barren environment?
I mean, there's so much that people practicing regenerative agriculture can learn from just taking that attitude, because, I mean, what you're talking about is, let's leave something, and of course that allows that plant to regenerate, and probably the life that depends on that plant also to regenerate.
Yep, you're exactly right. I think the problem with regenerative agriculture sometimes, and there's a beautiful thing, by the way, I just think that they're still trying to formalize it. Our process is a very informal process. The regenerative agriculture movement's a formal process. We have 2,000 years of replicability, and regenerative agriculture probably has less than 75. Our panel of experts, our rituals and our history and our stories, gone through our elders. Their panel of experts probably this peer review process. Our societal norms is based upon our indigenous value system. And I hate to say this, but regenerative agriculture might be based upon a capitalist value system. If we want to talk about rigor, I look at time tested for natural experiences over millennia. That's how we're able to determine rigor. And, and then you have the scientific method out there that's being spilled upon. It only has very short-term experiences. So when you stack them side by side, there is a lot of commonality on how things are set up, but there's just a little difference in how things are approached. Ours would have to be sustainable, because I challenge somebody to tell me an experiment that's been tried and tweaked and perfected for 2,000 years. I don't think you'll find anything like that here in the United States. I could be wrong, but who knows?
Right. Well, I mean, it's just such, no pun intended, food for thought. But, I mean, I have a great respect for science, and many of our listeners do too, and especially soil science. And at the same time, here you are doing practices that have not been subjected to double-blind, peer-reviewed studies, but they work. And, that should be enough, but sometimes that becomes, and you've written about this extensively, a disadvantage in terms of accessing, for example, programs that support the kind of agriculture that you're doing.
Yeah, I used to work for the Natural Resource Conservation Service out here at Hopi as a district conservationist, and they were always telling me, well, we need to have your people think about putting a cover crop on, or think about doing this type of practice or that type of practice, and all those practices that they mentioned to me were all had to be scientifically validated. And so when I would tell my farmers about this, people who I worked with, they would say, oh, we don't need to do that. We know what we're doing. It's very hard to tell a Hopi farmer how to farm or how to plant corn, because we've been doing it for such a long time. And so all these things were kind of foreign, and the bureaucracy was too thick also. And so what I was trying to do is, do a little bit something different here. I was just trying to develop something and work with NRCS to try to build a bridge so that we do not have to prove all of our techniques scientifically, that they just work, and that's based upon our 2,000 years of replication. NRCS, my God, they're less than 200 years old. Those things that they have proven are less than probably 100 years old. And so, it's just, what can we do in order to, to participate more fully in these conservation programs? And so I'm working on solutions for that right now.
What kind of solutions are you working on?
Well, right now I'm looking at, trying to talk with the National Association of Conservation Districts out there. They're a very good organization. They have NRCS's ear. And so, what I was thinking was trying to develop what they call this Indigenous Field Office Technical Guide that would allow us to basically come up with our own type of, use our own techniques and not have to scientifically explain them or validate them, because that is some form of intellectual property for one. Okay, so I just want to show people that we still know what we're doing, and we have been knowing what we're doing for a long time. And so one of the other things that I would like to do, and this is important, is that I would try to get In the Farm Bill, in 2018 Farm Bill, they have this alternative funding arrangements that's in there right now that allows tribes to basically, or could allow tribes to basically create their own conservation programs. And by doing so, they would be able to reinforce their culture and their identity. But right now, NRCS, from what I understand, is not even making an effort to go out there and outreach to Native communities to let them know what's going on. In fact, this is probably the last legislation in the Farm Bill that has any policy or has any written rules and regulations behind that. And so for the life of me, I just can't understand why NRCS does not want to get on board and help us farmers who basically don't have a big capital stream or a big source of income to take advantage of their programs.
Very interesting. I mean, talk more about the cultural identity piece and how that could be reinforced rather than ignored by better policy from NRCS or whoever.
Well, if we're able to do our own conservation program, we're able to probably use some of those funds for some labor and stuff like that to create incentives to, get kids more involved out here on the reservation, especially at Hopi, to basically go out there and learn how to farm properly. Learn all the things that go along with just farming. It's not just about putting seeds in the ground. It's about raising children for us. And so we need to figure out ways to harness what we have and pass that down to future generations. That would also include things like FFA and the 4-H programs out there. They're beautiful programs, but we need to be able to restructure that curriculum so it meets our own way of identifying ourselves and reinforcing our culture. Too many times do we have blanket policies in the United States that just don't work because they are blanket policies. And so we're just trying to figure out ways, and I'm trying to figure out ways in order to reinforce that. For example, here's another thing. If we had a fleet of tractors out here, we can get more people involved. And we're not talking like a 4,000 acre field like you have in Iowa. We're talking small 1 or 2 acre fields out here, or traditional type fields. Use our own techniques, get some sort of benefit from our cost benefit from NRCS, and allow us to do what we've been doing for 2,000 years. But we need to start it. We need to start this soon, because right now, not that many people farm, and so we're losing a lot of those valuable seeds that are the heart of who we are.
So you're doing seed saving, but that's labor intensive. So you've got to get the people interested in farming if you're going to keep on saving those seeds. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think, we have our ceremonies every single summer. And what happens is that a lot of those seeds are used to feed the people. A lot of those produce that are used to feed the people. And if we don't have that many people farming like I would like it, then we tend to use up all the supply. And then we have to go to the store and buy canned hominy and everything else like that, which isn't really traditional, and it doesn't teach us anything except how to open up a can, right? And so, I'm just trying to increase the people out here that to farm, and it's not so much that I can't do that, but it's not so much that I can't increase the people to farm, but it's getting them to understand, especially the younger generation, why they need to farm. What makes them, why do they have to do this? Why should they do this? We just need to enforce those type of values and those type of things on our children some more, so that they can become, whoever they will eventually, but also be tied to how they were brought up and the things that represent Hopi.
You were traditionally farmers going way back, right?
Mm-hmm. Traditionally, we were. In fact, when we got here, we were given 3 things by the person who was the guardian of this earth at the time. We were given a planting stick, we were given a gourd of water, and we were given seeds. And so that's all we had. And I like to use this quote, is that before we had ceremonies, we were farmers, because we had to do that in order to survive in this arid environment. So my generation goes back 250 generations of farming. And I challenge anybody in Iowa, Kansas, all up and down the farm belt there to find somebody who has more generations than Hopi farmers do.
Right. And, and I've heard people talk about this in New Mexico too, but it's like, you were mentioning that during the Great Depression, nobody really noticed that there was a Great Depression because you were growing food the way you always had. Is that right?
That's right. When I was sometimes my grandfather was still with us, he would tell us, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so when he said, well, we've been through this, stuff before, we had the Great Depression. They called it the Great Depression in the 30s, and people are running around out there. You can listen to the radio, but us Hopis, we weren't starving because everybody was still farming. We still had plenty of supply to eat. We've always been doing that. It's just that when you become dependent upon stores and things like that, then we start to lose our way of life. And so we need to figure out like I said, to get more people to farm out here on Hopi.
So you think if there were, for example, more tractors, then more young people would go into farming?
Well, I think it's not so much the amount of tractors, just setting up the examples. I mean, just setting up trying to get a co-op started out here, like 3 or 4 Hopi farmers going out and helping plow other people's fields. They do that today. They still do that today, but there needs to be more of that. A lot of these fields, if you were to do an aerial shot of that, a lot of them just been abandoned. Nobody's doing that anymore. And so when you talk to the people out here, a lot of them say, well, we don't have the tractor to go ahead and plow up a field, and we need somebody to help us plant, and then we can do that, but then it'll be up to them to take care of that field, because the field is very important, and it's kind of like a responsibility. And so I sure would like to get a fleet of tractors at some point, at least in my lifetime. But money's hard to find, because when we live on a reservation, capital it's a very rare commodity out here, and so we're just trying to find ways in order to do this dream that I'm thinking about.
So does that dream include basically self-sufficiency for Hopi people? Food self-sufficiency?
Oh yeah, I mean self-sufficiency, for everything, that's what we had before, but we got away from that, if you would think about this, if a lot of Native people were to have their own food hubs and everything else out there and on places that they survive, we wouldn't need any of these federal programs. But because we've become dependent upon the federal government, we have to use these federal programs. And a lot of the food that they give us, and things like that, or even some of the stuff that we have, it doesn't do as good. We have high records of diabetes, everything else, illness that we have the highest rate of suicides. We have every social Native American general, not so much on Hopi, but Native American general on reservations have these, what I call these socioeconomic discrepancies. Suicide, high rates of suicide, high rates of domestic violence, high rates of obesity, high rates of heart disease, all those type of things we have on reservations. And a lot of that has to do with, first of all, from our life being taken away, from our original life being taken away, and also just the food that we're given by the federal government, because it contains so much sugar and starch in there that our bodies just can't adapt to that and haven't adapted to that. We should be healthy individuals.
Very interesting. So when you talk to young people, are they getting that? Are they like sort of, again, no pun intended, but you're planting the seed in their mind that they could go into farming? Are you seeing that interest?
Yeah, I am. It's just sometimes, the parents, they're supposed to be teaching, especially the uncles, they're supposed to be taking the Hopi kids out there with them when they go out to farm, but sometimes I don't see that. I see them out there by themselves, and I ask them, I say, where are the kids at? And they say, well, they don't want to come, they're not too interested in it. But that's only because it's not being presented properly to them, I think, when I have children come up to here, one time I had a group of Head Start kids come up here, about 32 of them. They came up here and looked at my house, and I said, you guys want to farm? And I'd take them to my field and I'd show them. They said, yeah, we want to farm. And I said, ask your grandfather or your uncle to help you, teach you to farm. And says, they don't teach us that. And so we need to reinforce that. It needs to be a whole community effort in order to get these kids more interested in this type of thing.
It's just amazing to me how after centuries and millennia of tradition, just in like 1 or 2 generations, so much damage can be done by things that are so unhealthy in the first place, like that kind of junky food that is the staple of the American diet.
Yeah, I just think, it's just a lot of it is our own fault. I'm not gonna put, make an excuse and say it's all the federal government's fault. We bought into the system. We just bought into the system, and so we need to try to find ways to get us out of that type of system. And that, for me, that becomes farming, because farming teaches us a lot of responsibility. I cannot say that I cannot put somebody out here and say, hey, you're going to make a lot of money on that. Because farming for us is not based upon economics; it's based upon cultural and spiritual survival. And so, what I see happening is that what seems to happen out here is that the kids that go out and farm, they learn, they don't like it, but then they come back later on, like when they're a lot older and they start farming again, or they want to farm again because they learned all this stuff as a young person, and so that type of pattern I'd like to keep, but I'd like to have more people coming back, more people farming, more doing all this stuff, providing food for ourselves. We have some farmers markets that's going out here. We have two great entities out here, which I would give credit to, would be the Not Winnie Coalition, sponsored by the Hopi Foundation, and also the Hopi Permaculture Act, ran by Lillian Hill. Those type of things, and also the ancestral lands. They also bring people out to help the people farm out here. But we just need more of that. We need to create a better impact of what we can do.
I would think that as the rest of the country is, facing an economic bust right now. I mean, we're sort of always been in a boom bust economy. And then COVID-19, which pretty much I think everybody knows by now, is a result of, habitat fragmentation and really poor environmental practices, that turning back to traditions that work would be more attractive.
Yeah, there's a quote that was sponsored by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and it said, in 2018 that indigenous people protect 80% of global biodiversity on a mere 25% of the planet's land, with less than 5% of the world's population. My question is, what happened to the other 75%? What happened to the land that used to be 75% biodiverse on it? Where did that go? A lot of things that happened with COVID, from what I understand too, and there's been a couple of articles on that, was that the biodiversity was being wiped out. So these things that were treading this around, they had no other thing to basically get rid of that. And I can see a lot more of these type of diseases come along unless we protect that biodiversity. And so protecting the biodiversity in this case would be protecting what indigenous people have been doing since the get-go, and that's learning how to live with the environment, learning how to take care of these things correctly, increasing biodiversity, not dismantling it. And so I'm not a big fan of things like the Green Revolution, for example, was a great movement by some, but it also thwarted its way in there and destroyed a lot of indigenous ways of doing things. And so when we're talking about things moving on in the future, we need to look at that type of approach. We cannot just blanket policy everything, because what happens is we wind up destroying biodiversity rather than saving it and harnessing it and using it wisely.
What's an example of a way that the Green Revolution destroyed Indian lands?
Well, for example, it wasn't so much Indian lands in America, but if you look at, if you look at Africa and you look at some of the other places out there, they were saying, okay, we need to have more. We need to take care of 1 million people. We need to feed all this. And so they went in there and what they did was they just came up with all these new crops that were coming out, and they just took away their old crops and said, plant this, you'll have more food to eat. And by doing that, what happens is when you have a big drought or something, these crops that aren't drought resistant, these monocrops, they just get wiped out, and you leave those people with nothing. They're worse off than before what you had. And so that's what the Green Revolution was doing, is saying we need to use technology in order to help these people. But technology, in most cases, destroyed their way of life. It did not help their way of life.
You work with the Native American Agriculture Fund. What is that organization doing?
Well, we're doing a lot of things. We go out and send out grants to just about 4 different entities, and so we're able to do that: education, nonprofits, 501c3 organizations, instrumentalities of tribal governments, CDFIs, community development fund initiatives. And so we're going out and we're doing that. And there's some interesting stats on that. I don't have those with me, but we've been doing a lot of that. In fact, we provided, I think it was $1.4 million in COVID rapid response funding to all of our 2019 grantee awardees, so that they can able to overcome things like a computer or Zoom accounts or something that they would need in order to keep them going. And so what we're trying to do, and what's the most important thing that we're trying to do, is we're trying to build relationships so that we can make all these Indian agricultural programs sustainable over the long run, and not just 1 or 2 years and then there's no money and then things fade out. And so we're working on all types of situations and all sorts of new policies that are going to come out of that pretty soon. And so I can't really talk about that right now, but they are going to be coming out probably within the next month or so.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to follow up on that on this program. I mean, I think the whole idea of building food capacity on
Mhm.
reservations and moving toward at least steps toward more self-sufficiency, that's also really tied to traditional methods. And I find that fascinating. I mean, it really kind of speaks of the failure of the Green Revolution in so many ways and of quote unquote conventional agriculture, that what's really most adaptive for native people, not to mention for everybody else, is a much more traditional and regenerative approach.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. I mean, regenerative. Regeneration. I mean, that's the whole thing. Generation. That's what we've been doing. It's just that we've got so far away from that, and a lot of indigenous societies have had that. But there are good things like the Blackfeet up there. Getting the whole of the bison herds and everything like that allow us to do what we need to do. Starting to set up like the Quapaw in Oklahoma have their own processing plant onto small plant, but it serves a good region. And it's just trying to get our own food system taken care of first, and then like I said, we won't need SNAP funds, we won't need any of this stuff. We'll be truly self-sufficient again, and I hope that comes to fruition. We're working on things like that right now with the Native American Agricultural Fund, and just a matter of time before somebody says, hey, you know what, we know what we're doing, those guys know what they're doing. And so I'm hoping that we'll get the support that we need in order to push this agenda forward.
What are you growing on your own farm this year?
Oh, I'm planted at least four different types of corn. I've got yellow, white, blue, and our Hopi sweet corn. I've got about two different varieties of squash, about four different types of melons. I've got about four different types of beans. Beans meaning like temporary beans and lima beans and things like that. And so I've got all that growing out there, and I've got about probably around 10 acres of fields out there that I have growing right now. And so it's just what I do, and it's what I love.
And do you then save your seeds in the fall?
Yeah, see, what I do is when my aunt was alive, and I've got people to step in now that my aunt passed on, is that the harvest belongs to the women, and so does the land. By the way, the farm, all we do is take care of it. All the men do is take care of it. So what the women do is they take the harvest that comes off the field. They look for certain traits, and I don't really know what those are, but they look for certain traits and they store that seed away to plant the next year. Now that's been going on for 2,000 years as well, and so a lot of our strands or strains in what we produce are still real pure. And so they're able to adapt to things like only 6 to 10 inches of rainfall a year. Corn can come up for an average depth of 6 to 18 inches a year from being placed in the soil. And so they're constantly looking for traits that allow us to constantly produce things.
So, do you, like, for example, might they say, well, this was a really bad drought year, so we're going to save the most successful seeds from the most successful plants to plant in other drought years? Well, I guess you don't know at the
Yeah,
beginning
that's
of the
what. Yeah,
year.
well, no, no. Well, you don't really know yet until after you go through the drought. Most of the time, one of the things that we try to do here at Hopi is we try to have enough to raise enough that'll last us 3 to 5 years. If you look at that, that's kind of like the cycle of the El Nino, or whatever they call it.
Mm.
And so we're always trying to preserve things and put things away. And so what I've heard before too is that some farmers would just, when they had a drought year, they would save that seed and they would plant it again in another drought year. And you can tell if you're going to have a drought or not, believe it or not, because you look at the different types of vegetation that's on the ground. In fact, in the springtime, I look for certain plants. You can call them biological indicators, whatever they want to call them out in the scientific community. But we're able to gauge like our planting depth, how far we need to space our plants, just by looking at these natural plants that occur depending upon the type of moisture we have in the soil.
Very interesting. Well, is there anything else that you want to let us know about?
I'm just thinking, I just wish that people would look at or try to change their philosophy, like I was talking about, like looking at things as you would plant, taking care of a relative rather than a scientific point of view of conserving a natural resource. And I say that because, we have a lot of different situations out there. People are suffering mentally from this COVID thing. And, when they can't raise out there, they can't, they don't have enough money to, or people aren't buying things, the farmer starts to feel the pinch right there. And then what happens eventually is that, unfortunately, a lot of them, have to sell their farm back to the bank, or they don't have enough money to pay for things. And they wind up hurting themselves. They either commit suicide or they have some sort of mental anguish which they shouldn't have. And that's a real problem. At Hopi, we learned to do that thing, and we learned to take care of those, and that type of problem. And that was because we do have crop failure. We don't plan for that, but we have seen that before many times, and so we're able to adjust psychologically from that. But unfortunately, we're not tied so much into the economic factor of things. And so what I would have to say, honestly, is just try to change your philosophy. Try to have a little bit more different mental approach to farming. That when we do lose things, it's not the end all. There are things that the sun will come up the next day. And so that's kind of, I guess, how I address that.
Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson is a traditional Hopi farmer and research associate with the Native American Agriculture Fund. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and you have a great day, too.
You too. This program is produced in collaboration with the Kivira Coalition, a non-for-profit educational organization and community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to the resilience of arid working lands. Their work aims to shift current practices of agriculture and land stewardship to those that produce good food, support meaningful livelihoods in rural places, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Kivira and how you can support their work, visit kiviracoalition.org, Quivira, coalition.org. You've been listening to Down to Earth, a production of the Kivira Coalition and the Radio Cafe. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. If you like this program, please share it with your network. And we'd love your feedback. Go to downtoearth.media, where you can contact us and you can sign up for the mailing list. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We're producing this show bi-weekly and would love your comments and ideas. So once again, downtoearth.media, and check out the Kivira Coalition, kiviracoalition.org. That's Quivira. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.